All right, I think we have, looks like 20 people on the call. So I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, welcome. Very excited to have you for this session for the CEO and CFO Leadership Institute. Today we are covering Module 5, which is the 5th of 7 modules, and we will be discussing health center governance. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few quick housekeeping items with everyone. As always, welcome from NAC. My name is Olivia Peterson. I work in the TTA division for training and event support. I'll be supporting this event as your technical host. And I will be handing things over in just a minute to my colleague, Cindy Thomas, who is our Director of Leadership Training. But before I do that, I'm just going to go over a couple really brief housekeeping items. As always, please note this event is being recorded. We will be sharing the recording with all of you via NaudlePod. It should be available within the next week or so. As you all know, Zoom allows you to join by video or phone. So if you have any issues with your audio today, feel free to call in. You can also send me a note in the chat if you're having any issues. I'll do my best to troubleshoot for you. And then throughout today's session, please feel free to share your comments, any questions you have. We have the chat box open and available to you. You can also raise your hand. We'll be keeping an eye out. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and we will call on you to unmute yourself. You will notice that all lines are automatically muted when you join the call today. We do ask that you please keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking, just to reduce any background noise and interruptions. So thank you in advance for that. And then if you are looking for the slides for today, they can be found in the calendar invitation that was sent out. And then finally, we will have an evaluation to share with you all at the end of the call today. So we really encourage you to give us any feedback that you have and respond to that evaluation. It always helps us to hear from you. So thank you in advance for your responses. So with that, I am going to go ahead and turn things over to my colleague, Cindy Thomas, to get us started for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Olivia, and welcome back, everybody. I did see a question in the chat about the revenue cycle slides, the session that's concurrent with this one for the CFOs. That recording will be available in the community. Olivia, I believe it takes about a week. Is that correct?
Yes, it'll be the same for the recording for this session and for the other one. We'll try to have it available for you guys within like the next week.
And that'll be in the NaudlePod community if you have interest in viewing that and seeing the slides from that session. But for today, for our session, we have a powerhouse team we're bringing to you. I'll give you just a quick introduction to them, and then I'm going to turn the day over to them and let them have as much time as possible to interact and engage with you. First, I'd like to introduce Emily Hurd. She is our Director of Health Center Governance Training at NAC, if you haven't met her before. She develops and implements governance training, technical assistance for Health Center Board of Directors through our NAC TTA division. And we also have Stephen Serra as the Chair of the MHC Healthcare Board of Directors, is a NAC Grassroots MVP Award recipient and the managing member of Catalina Wealth Partners, LLC, based in Marina, Arizona. And I will let both of them go into more detail if they would like. I can share their full bios in the community for you, but I don't want to take up more of their time. Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Cindy and Olivia. Stephen and I are so excited to be here with you, our cohort of newish CEOs. I also recognize some of your mentors as faculty in our Health Center Governance Portfolio training. It'll be great to hear from you all. So as Cindy mentioned, I direct our board training and technical assistance program. Really excited to be able to talk about governance today. We know as CEOs, working with your board takes a lot of time. Perhaps you were surprised in stepping into the role as to exactly how much time it takes. But one thing that we think is really critical in having these types of training dialogues is to include folks that are on the ground as board members. And so Stephen and I partner quite a bit in terms of deploying training. Stephen, anything else you want folks to know before we officially kick off today?
No, excited to be a part of the conversation and welcome everybody.
Terrific. All right, Olivia, we can go to the next slide. So just in terms of our focus areas today, we're going to start off by exploring relationships. So of course, we know the board and CEO have a unique relationship. You are the only employees that are formally selected by your boards of directors. We're also going to talk about the unique role between the board chair and CEO. And then because the other part of your cohort were CFOs, we're going to talk a little bit about how the treasurer of your board works with your CFO and what that means for you as CEOs. And we're going to spend a little bit of time examining pillars of good governance. And then finally, what we hope to do is for you to gain familiarity with resources from NAC to support your health center board. We have about 50 tools and resources, and really the purpose of the portfolio is to make things easier for all of you in terms of board training. So Olivia, we can go to the next slide. We're not going to spend a great deal of time on the fundamentals of board roles and responsibilities. You all are CEOs, and so we trust that you're already familiar with board roles and responsibilities. We do want to just lift up a few items for your awareness. First and foremost, what we have tried to do at NAC is through our governance guide for health center boards, which you see on your screen, it's linked here, is to frame over all board roles and responsibilities. Because most of you are CEOs of 501c3 nonprofits. And so we need boards to be looking at their roles and responsibilities from a big picture perspective. And then what we do is put HRSA Health Center program compliance in the context of overall board roles and responsibilities. A number of years ago, when I first had a chance to work with health center boards, I found that sometimes boards would really zero in on HRSA Health Center program compliance as the universe of their roles and responsibilities, and that's not true. So what we've really tried to do in this particular resource is lift up and frame board roles in a very short and digestible way. Olivia, we can go to the next slide. Some of you may have had a chance as part of your pre-work to view a short video that's linked on this slide titled Health Center Board Roles. It's about 10 minutes, and it provides boards with a really high-level overview of the main buckets of their roles and responsibilities for governance. Everything from strategy to the various facets of oversight and policy, as well as functioning. And so that's a tool that you can use with your own boards if some are still struggling with sort of understanding what a board's role is. We'll go to that next slide, Olivia. And we just also wanted to make you aware that in the governance guide for health center boards, there is a short matrix. So if you have stepped into a health center where the board is really sort of maybe not quite clear on what's the board's role for governance, what's the CEO's role for management, this is a particular tool that you can use here. So again, we just wanted to make sure that you were aware that these baseline resources about board roles and responsibilities existed before we actually get into the heart of today's dialogue. So we can go to the next slide. So we want to now shift gears and dig in on one of our first focus areas, which are relationships. And in the chat, we wondered if folks would be willing to share with us what is important to you about the CEO board partnership. So if you don't mind just taking a second to do that. And as you take a second to answer in chat, Stephen, what has been important for you from the board chair perspective?
I would say the big thing is just the opportunity to establish that relationship. And it's been sort of centered around the ability to frame and really define how we communicate together. And I think that's really set a foundation for our CEO and our board to be able to function properly together. And so I would say it's just that concept about setting parameters and boundaries and communication standards have been super helpful for us.
That's great. And I see in chat, we've had all of those echoed: trust, good communication, collaboration and trust and support, full transparency of successes and challenges. That's great. Collaboration and trust, mutual understanding of responsibilities, open dialogue, collaboration, effective relationship, lots of sort of echoing accountability. All right, let's go to the next slide, which, you've already answered the question, all of you. This is a slide that we included in here. We thought it might be helpful to take back to your boards if there's a particular area around the board and CEO partnership where you want to open up a dialogue or perhaps sort of expand the focus of the partnership. Certainly role clarity is the essential foundation of a board and CEO partnership, really making sure that your board is fully aware of what is their governance role vis-a-vis your management role. Trust, respect, and open communication. And I'm actually curious, especially for those of you that said trust, how have you gone about, especially as new CEOs, in developing that trust with your board? So if anybody has a tip to share, perhaps add that in chat. Somebody also spoke to shared strategic focus, and I think that is so important. It's having that shared understanding of where is the health center going, of course, building that into the CEO's accountability and evaluation, but also making sure that your board is building strategic goals into their own work plan or committee work. Stephen, I think that you've taken a particularly focused approach with that. You want to share a little bit about how you've ensured shared strategic focus?
Yeah, shared strategic focus. It's funny because it's as the comments were coming through, we saw communication, open dialogue, and so really with the shared strategic focus, it's been about doing a couple things. It was in sort of enabling and empowering our CEO, having a conversation, saying, for example, our strategic planning process is a great example. We just are coming out of that and finalizing all that. And it really was this communication of setting a groundwork of saying, we want to have some great data to be able to use. What would that be? What would that look like? And so our CEO was then able to go to several different meetings with chiefs and directors and come back to us with information. And then from a board perspective, we were able to then bring sort of our perspective as being patients and what we're seeing out there in all the different health centers. And so by sort of comparing those two things together, we're now sharing this focus of figuring out where we are today, where we want to go. And it really sort of is that concert and balance between the two parties in the room, if you will.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think having that shared strategic focus, having that sort of dynamic then leads to another pillar, which is mutual accountability. And so we'll talk in a few minutes about how the board, of course, provides oversight of the CEO, but in having that shared strategic focus, the board can also hold itself accountable through a board self-assessment or other type of measurement. And then, Stephen, of course, having all of this in place, in theory, makes navigating crisis or difficult moments such as the pandemic, when many of the CEOs joining us today actually stepped into their role, more manageable. What's been really important for your board and CEO in terms of managing this particular moment in time?
Yeah, it's going to sort of be like a broken record, but it's about the setting and establishing communication. Starting off by talking about how frequently you want to communicate, the best method, whether it's certain things by text, by email, by call. But really, I would say like the thing recently has been staffing's been the biggest challenge that's been stressing out our team and our CEO particularly. So, some of the things that come up there are just being able to be there to listen and support. There's and often a lot of ways you feel helpless as a board member. As a board chair, you want to be a great and effective partner. And so often it's just being able to be there to be supportive. And then the other thing that we started early on, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, is creating shared agreements and talking about what is the groundwork we want to lay in terms of how and when something bad comes up, how are we going to manage and navigate that conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I'm also seeing that echoed in the chat. I'm seeing a lot of mention of having agreements, having routine meetings, really making sure that that's built into the relationship. Thank you. And one person also shared that they build trust by making sure that there's intentional onboarding and meeting with new board members as they come on. So thank you for sharing that. All right, let's go to the next slide. So we hope this doesn't happen to you, but there is an interesting article that we linked in the slide deck around what to do or what to think about if tension arises. It is feasible during your tenure as CEO that this could happen between the board and CEO. Some of the frequent root causes are sort of the opposite of what we just reviewed as the core components of the partnership. Lack of role clarity. So if your board is struggling with this, really thinking about what kind of training can you put in place, how can you leverage your relationships either with your executive committee or with your board chair to think about intervention and sort of redirecting the conversation when that happens. Sometimes change can also cause tension between a board and CEO. We've been through a lot of change. And then the absence of effective governance practices can cause tension. And we'll talk more about effective governance in just a few minutes. And some of the risks, if there's a lack of a positive partnership between the board and CEO, could be a negative impact on morale, board member or CEO departures, or other sort of impacts on the health center. So if this is something that you've experienced or that you want to learn more about, we do encourage you to look at that article. All right, Olivia, let's go to the next slide. Before we pivot and speak specifically about the particularly close relationship between the board chair and CEO, we did also just want to pause and talk about CEO oversight by the board. We know that this is something that is important to CEOs. And so just wanted to spend a little bit of time laying out some good practices and hope that, that your board is providing adequate support in this area. So in terms of CEO goal setting, hopefully your board has worked with you to establish annual performance goals that are tied to the strategic plan, maybe just by raising of hands or thumbs up in the through the reactions. Let us know if you have that in place. Having CEO goals in place in concert with your board is really critical to then making sure that your board is evaluating your performance. There's data that actually shows that CEOs stay longer and are more satisfied when they receive an annual evaluation. Hopefully your board never surprises you. You've agreed on a CEO evaluation tool. You provide your own self-assessment, your full board is asked for input, and members of your board sit down and review that with you as the CEO. Stephen, what's worked well for your board related to CEO goal setting and CEO evaluation?
Yeah, so the first thing for us, Emily, it was sort of starting from a place of respect and appreciation for our CEO and wanting to come up with something that would recognize his value to the organization where he felt valued and important and acknowledged. And so this whole conversation is very important because it really was a great opportunity for us to show our appreciation as a board. And so we started off with sort of a mutual agreement how we wanted to handle this. So that's even starting off with the CEO's contract. You know, agreeing on a local attorney that we could go to and mutually share information with, and sort of setting the proper groundwork where there was understanding that we're creating this contract. We encouraged our CEO to seek out counsel to make sure he felt his interests were covered, that the health center's interests were covered. We then expanded that out to hiring a third party to come in and help be a part of this. And if you're fortunate enough and your board has somebody that is an HR specialist or somebody that does recruiting or consulting, that's great. But honestly, most boards do not have that. And certainly that was the case for us. We had a lot of business administrative experience, business ownership experience, if you will, but nobody that's really done any kind of meaningful work in this area. So we agreed upon a third party, a consultant that's actually here locally that's worked with lots of health centers and helped to develop a compensation structure that was built around goals that directly attach to our strategic plan and other goals that we highlighted around our mission. And so that included things to do with basic measurements that are handed down, things that are easily trackable, things that are mutually beneficial. And so I think as I stand back and look at this slide, it's such an amazing opportunity. And the thing that I would really want to work with a CEO on is mutual appreciation and mutual sort of ownership of this process, and really don't want it to be the board coming up with something telling the CEO, but really a mutual process.
Absolutely. And we're seeing in chat, Stephen, others that have really tried to instill a solid CEO evaluation and compensation strategy. And Stephen's comments have already sort of foreshadowed the integral connection between goal setting, evaluation, and compensation, which of course should be based on data. Sometimes that can be a tricky thing to navigate, but making sure again that that's a data-driven conversation.
Yes.
The last two things, and then I definitely want to get to some questions that are coming up in chat. In some states, you may also have a contractual agreement to spell out the CEO's role that you've set with your board. And the last point that Stephen and I just wanted to make on here, and I know many of you are new CEOs, some of you are more tenured mentors, but really making sure that succession planning is something that is embraced by you and your board collectively, and that it's sort of no longer, something that's considered negative or off limits.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about having an emergency succession plan in place, that really is something that you can partner with your board on to lay out a plan so that in the event that you did need to step away in an emergency situation, your health center could have continuity of leadership, and then also a succession policy so that in the event that there is a leadership transition, your board already has the plan. A little bit later on, we'll go through some resources that are available to you, but we did just want to tee that up. Stephen, anything to share on succession planning?
The only thing that came to mind, Emily, was just sort of the appreciation that we have from the board perspective, how much confidence that instills in us when we have our leader embrace that process and sort of let any of the negativity out of the room and look at that in any sort of negative way. It really is about the board wanting to partner with the CEO to really be prepared for the worst that could come up. So yeah, I think it really reflects highly on our CEOs, and it builds. We were talking about things that build trust. That's certainly one of the greatest things our CEO has helped us with along the way and instilled a lot of confidence.
Thank you, Stephen. So we do have a couple of questions, and actually I think that is absolutely right and true. I did want to just pause though and go to a question that has come up in chat, and there's a couple of threads I want to get through. It does take the conversation in a little bit of a different direction, but it's still related to board roles and responsibilities. So one of the CEOs had a board member who tried to steer our cash on the balance sheet to a financial services company that he works for. Lately, he emailed my CFO angrily, moving away from the vendor that is his, I guess, high school friend. Any idea on handling? So somebody, a peer, has already put in the chat that good practice to have in place is a conflict of interest statement, and make sure that board members are annually disclosing conflicts of interest, that they're being raised and folks are being recused from either discussion or voting on particular interests. The person that originally raised the question says that they do have a conflict of interest in place, but this particular board member can be aggressive. So you think, in addition, Stephen, to sort of making sure that the conflicts of interest are being managed, which I agree with and I think has been addressed, anything from a board chair perspective? Might the CEO want to talk with their board chair about having an offline type of discussion with this board member? What would your guidance be, sort of, at least with the details we have to go on?
No, that's so good. That's directly what the response should be. I recognize that every board is comprised of different personalities, and that's sort of one of the, you could say, maybe fun, not fun parts of the role between being a CEO as you deal with all that. But really, in my perspective, is anytime there's sort of this sort of conflict or an issue of this nature, which is obviously a conflict of interest issue, is addressing it directly and head on, and doing it in a one-off way with your board chair. And certainly how I would approach that would be to deal with that directly, talk to that aggressive person. I think it's like one of those things where certain personalities, maybe you don't feel your board chair can do that. But in working with that, there's a process that we've ingrained in our board, is if certain personalities might fit a situation better, we're certainly comfortable pulling in that particular board member. So if you have another board member that maybe is better at dealing with conflict, or somebody that you feel is as aggressive and sort of meet the hand, if you will, that's what I would recommend. But in this situation, it shouldn't be sort of skirted. It shouldn't be swept under the rug. It should be addressed directly and in a manner that's respectful and with dignity. But there's no question that person and that situation is a conflict of interest. And there's really a great opportunity here to go directly to that conflict and figure out what's sort of underneath, and then go from there. And again, another opportunity to build trust. But really, it's something that I think you sort of nailed on the head. It's going directly at it.
Yeah, thank you. And there's been more exchange and peer guidance in the chat. Keep that coming. That's terrific. All right, let's go to our next slide, Olivia. We want to talk a little bit about the special relationship between the board chair and chief executive. So, of course, the board chair leads your board, and to Stephen's point, hopefully can help navigate challenging circumstances like the one that was just raised. You as the CEO lead the health center, and together you have a dynamic partnership, hopefully. Let's go to the next slide. Really making sure that there is some foundational components in place truly can bring better results for the health center and for the board. And so one easy framework that we like to point to is on this slide. The first is really having a shared commitment between the CEO and board chair. And that is sort of echoed and an extension of your board and CEO being on the same page. Having a clear framework for your relationship. We'll talk a little bit more about how you can establish that through just direct dialogue and establishing agreements for how you're going to meet, what you're going to work on together. And then the last is a supportive context. So really making sure that both parties are coming to the relationship with good intent. Stephen, anything, I know you shared a little bit about your working relationship with your CEO. I know that it's sort of taken many different forms, especially through the pandemic, but anything you want to share specific to the board chair CEO partnership?
Really keep us moving along here, but I think just to reiterate, it's sort of that sense of being able to have a sense of what's coming. And you mentioned the pandemic, I mentioned staffing earlier, but the thing that's really helpful to me, and I think to our board, is to have our CEO. Part of our framework was to always lead with the worst. When you come and talk to us, we lead with the worst. Give us sort of the gist of it, as big a bad monster or dragon that it is. Tell us everything that we need to know. And that really helps us to then slide into that supportive context instead of feeling like we're having to sort of sort through what is he or she not saying. So being more direct, going straight to it as quickly as possible, lead with worst would say the biggest thing for us.
Thank you. All right, Olivia, let's go to the next slide. What this is really a takeaway. These are discussion prompts that you can use with your board chair if you haven't already had some of these direct dialogues. So it can be as simple as asking, how often should we meet or speak? What's the best way to reach you? And it can be everything down to, when conflict emerges, how do you want to handle it? How can we best work together to resolve disagreements? Or to the point that came up earlier, how can we best work together to manage conflicts or issues that might be coming up on the board? I will say, I was just talking to somebody the other day that had this type of dialogue, and what it surfaced was that the CEO actually felt that the board wasn't doing a good enough job. I'm paraphrasing, with their evaluation process. The CEO felt like they weren't getting enough out of it. It wasn't being constructively framed enough. Again, this is me. I'm sure the CEO used some different language, but and the board chair was really receptive to hearing that. And so if you haven't had time to sort of sit down and just have this intentional conversation, we would really encourage you to do so. All right, next slide, which is just, if you do have these types of agreements, please feel free to share one in chat. I think some of you shared earlier that you meet periodically with your board chairs, but if there's a particular agreement that is working well for you, we'd love to hear about that in chat. And we will move to our next slide, which is just some reflection questions for you. So these are just questions that you can reflect on after today's session. How did or will you go about developing a partnership with your chair? What agreements are working well? Conversely, you could also think about what agreements aren't working well. What parts of the board chair CEO relationship do you find most challenging, and how are you thinking about possibly addressing those? So again, just some reflection questions for after today. Olivia, next slide. All right, so we did want to pause because we know the other part of this cohort are CFOs. And yes, we know that the board selects the CEO, and that is the only member of the team that reports to the board. But of course, your CFOs and your other C-suite staff have relationships and work with your board through committee. The one that we thought was particularly applicable today was the CFO and treasurer interaction. I know we've already had some exchange in the chat around, you as CEOs are going to set parameters really for what does that relationship look like? How do you want your staff to be communicating back with you after committee meetings to make sure that there are no surprises? And so certainly laying that groundwork is critical and important, but I think we also just wanted to acknowledge that, of course, your staff is going to interact with your board. And so, Stephen, I know you're also a former treasurer of a board before you became board chair. What worked well in your particular, during your particular time as treasurer with this dynamic?
Yeah, there was a couple things. So first of all, I'm in finance. I'm in the business on a daily basis, and switching over to the nonprofit world was a huge learning curve. And if you have a treasurer that maybe does not have a financial background or just sort of willing to step in, that learning curve can be pretty steep. And honestly, even for me, I would say it took almost, I would say at least 8 to 9 months to finally start to get a rhythm and figure out what was happening. So it's okay sort of to communicate that process to the board, that there is a learning curve. So there were a couple things that we did and changed. The first one is that we met more regularly when I was first getting off the ground running as treasurer with our CFO to really have a lot of education so I could get a better understanding. So it really was sort of an investment of front loading, and it really paid off in the end for us. So there's a lot of education that I was then able to pass on and be a point of reference for my fellow board members. The other thing is we ingrained into our agendas continuing education sections that were focused around our HRSA supplemental and required measures that we keep track of on our dashboards. And that really helped us to sort of communicate to the board that there's a lot of information that's coming your way, but at a minimum, these are the things that every month in and month out, you should be looking for. And then we intertwined some really great continuing education about what the measurements are, what they mean, and try to bring them down to a level that took away all of the money speak and really into layman's terms to make it sensible for everybody. This is a part of the board meeting where eyes typically glaze over. There's so many things that are happening, but it's the single most important thing you could say in many ways that we covered, the budgeting process and going through all this to make sure we're on track. And so really, I think it was, in retrospect, the best thing that we did was sort of invest in education up front. And it was a big project, but it did pay off greatly for us.
Yeah, that's terrific. Certainly making the complex digestible is a continuing critical component around board education. All right, so let's go to our next slide. We're going to pivot a little bit. We've talked a lot about relationships and considerations around relationships. We're going to talk a lot now about good governance practices. If there are things that are working well for you, please put them in chat. The first good governance practice we're not going to spend a lot of time on because I think we've already touched on it, and that is the importance of having role clarity, right? So making sure that your board does understand what its governing role is, making sure that there's respect for where that line is with the CEO, and then making sure that there's an appropriate power balance. So having a positive partnership certainly contributes to that. And then ensuring that your board really understands that they operate as a collective. They're all in it together, they're a team, and ideally no single member is dominating. Olivia, we can go to our next slide where we're going to spend a little bit more time. The next theme around good governance is really promoting a strategic focus. And there's a couple of ways that we talk about this from a good governance lens. The first is ensuring a strategic focus. So this is everything from ensuring that your board and you as the CEO and board are really thoughtful about how is the board going to contribute to the strategic plan, right? There was a day when sort of the board would maybe rubber stamp a strategic plan, and ideally that is not happening now. The board is engaged really actively in thinking about where's the health center going, that plan formation is a partnership, but also that strategy isn't just relegated to the strategic planning process, right? So constantly there are strategic issues coming up that merit board discussion. Stephen, I know that your board has gone through a strategic planning process recently. How have you approached this?
Yeah, the first thing that we did is we sort of set the groundwork to figure out how we wanted to pull in all the data. And like I mentioned earlier, we had these interviews and these meetings set up with our CEO and our consultant that we were working with had met with our chiefs. We made sure that we had information that was coming sort of from the ground up. But really the most important value that we have as being a board member is the patient majority. And that's the opportunity for us to be able to talk about what our experiences are. What are some things that we'd like to see improved? What are some things that we'd like to see in the future? And so, as far as the team members and colleagues that are on the call today, it's really leveraging that bit of it because, there's a lot of stuff that's going to come across that we just really, board members are pretty smart. They're really great at what they do in so many ways, but it can get pretty complex, and the ability to get lost is in all the data is there for us. So it's really sort of focusing on the value that we can bring, which is that of being a patient. And as well as I would say, you mentioned the rubber stepping bit of it. That's a really big concern. And the only way that I've ever experienced a way around that is to have such good dialogue before you get started in the process about what's the data. So for example, using our needs assessment as a really great example is what we've used in past years. And so just taking all that data, what are our chiefs telling us and our directors telling us from the ground level, and then as a patient, what information do we have? So things sort of laying that groundwork before you get off and running, just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks.
Thanks for sharing that. The next area of promoting a strategic focus is really focusing on effective board functioning. And ideally, you have a strong board chair that can really take the lead, so this is not falling on you. But as a CEO, really ensuring that you have a grounding in what do effective committees look like? How do they function? They can be terrific ways to support the work of your board. A couple of tips is just one is ensuring that your committee structure is right-sized for your board size, right? If you have a board of 10 people, having 6 or 7 or 8 committees is probably more than your board can handle, right? So really thinking strategically about, with your board chair and board, what's the right committee structure? The second is really making sure that your committees are focused on the work of governance and not mimicking staff functions. I think I was more concerned about this 5+ years ago. I think boards are generally doing a much better job, really focusing on making sure that they have a governance or nominating committee, making sure that they have finance and audit covered, quality. I'm seeing less and less of those committees that mimic CEO functions or executive team functions, which is a good thing, but that's always just something to be aware of. Right. And then ensuring that your committees have a strategic focus, right? So, to Stephen's point, maybe connecting your committee goals to overarching goals for your board. And Stephen, you also use a work plan, I believe, to help keep track of everything the board does, but specifically also for committees. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, gladly. So when I had the opportunity to serve in this role a little over about 4 years ago, there were several changes that really were important to get immediately going. So the first one is we didn't want to take our time during the board meetings to review something that was sort of brand new to everybody without really having a chance to delve into it properly. And so we restructured the process because there would be situations that would come up where you're voting on it, you want to take action on it, but maybe you do not have enough data, you don't want to push it another month back, and it sort of created this issue. And so we changed our whole structure to where our committee work is so much better today. And all the information that's going to come to the board for acceptance is run through a committee where it's then been able to sort of being taken at a deeper level and have better conversations. So the recommendation that then comes from committee to the board for acceptance, we know that there's been great work. It's also evidenced or found in our committee minutes. So those are really great resources as well. You mentioned the work plan. So all of our committees have individual work plans. And then at the board level, everything rolls up to one large work plan that I use with the executive committee. We review all of our committee structures at least annually. We review the work plan for each one of our committees annually as well. And that helps us to ensure that all the moving parts are getting the attention that they need. And then the last thing in terms of effective committee work is and there's a lot of, I think, several different forms of this, but we enacted a sort of a memorandum, which is a one-page document that you can look at. It'll show what the issue at hand is being discussed, and then it'll just talk about which committee sort of took up the issue, CEO approval, is there a financial impact, what's the recommendation from the committee, and that's attached to every document, every motion that's going to be brought forward to the board. So if you're on a specific committee, not in that particular committee, and you're going to be asked to vote on that the next board meeting, you can pull that up. You'll see it on the agenda. You can go straight to the memorandum and get a really good sense of all the work that's gone into it. And so those are just a couple things I would throw out there that have been very effective for us, Emily.
Thanks, Stephen, and not surprisingly, you're getting requests to share your sample board work plan and committee plans. We could maybe talk about that offline. And if not, we do have some samples in our governance
Absolutely.
guide for health center boards that folks can look at in the interim. But we'll put that on our to-do list for follow-up.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you. All right, let's talk next about effective meetings. We know it is a heavy lift for you as CEOs. To meet monthly with your boards. Of course, it is a requirement, and so it's something that we have to accept and plan for, as I know that you all do. But Olivia, we'll go to the next slide. We just have some considerations related to practices that you can be implementing with your board chair to develop thoughtful agendas and meeting practices. So the first is making sure that those meeting packets, of course, packet is such an antiquated term, and I should update this because it's really probably an online portal or a SharePoint site where you're directing your board members to, right? But ideally, these are being sent in advance. You know, here we have 5 to 7 days. We know during the pandemic that was probably a lofty goal, but the importance is really making sure that your board is getting the information that it needs and can digest it before you're talking about it in a board meeting. Stephen, anything sort of that's worked really well for your board in terms of time frame for getting information out?
Yeah, that was one of our shared agreements, honestly, with our CEO, was that, you know, we know that there's extenuating circumstances that will come up where you need to sort of get something to the board, but really we'd like to have it in advance. We would prefer to have it run through the appropriate committee first, but in certain situations, especially like you mentioned during COVID, that wasn't always possible. The other thing that we did is, you know, right about the time that I had the opportunity to start serving in this role, is we switched over from doing sort of this Bible-sized packet of paper that would be in front of us in the boardroom to electronic version of packets, and that was through a company called Diligent, and it's an app-driven resource that we use, and we have lots of tools and resources there, including our bylaws and our strategic plan. You know, our work plans are on there, but that's really been a really helpful way to get board packets on there. And then, as you all know, things will be sort of coming up. You're trying to gain momentum and speed towards the meeting. Something else comes up. Diligent also allows us, and I don't get paid, or it's not a shameless plug or anything, but it's really been great. So then you can go on and they can add, and you just sync up, and it gives you the most up-to-date agenda or item that was changed. So for us, Emily, it was really using some of the technology and tools that are out there, because maybe you're right about the packets, but I'm going to keep saying packets as well.
Yeah, one of those examples of how eventually our language will shift. The next tip that we had for you is consider using a consent agenda. I would be curious to know through reactions, thumbs up, or otherwise, whether you're using these on your board meeting agendas. I'm going to talk through what they are just in case folks are not. A consent agenda is, again, kind of a misleading name because it's actually an agenda item on your board meeting agenda, and you can bundle things that don't merit discussion, right? So it might be approval of your board meeting minutes, it might be certain types of reports, it might be just any type of item that a board doesn't need to officially vote on. So I'm seeing a lot of you actually do use consent agendas.
Yes.
They're great ways to free up time for dialogue. Stephen, do you use these as a tool?
We certainly have. Currently, the way it's set up is we have a version of that. But yes, I'm a big fan of the consent agenda. Our board meetings were running 3 hours. So one of the first things we did is we tried to figure out, you know, it's not so much that the time is the issue. It was sort of the effective use of that time. And so we were able to run a lot more efficient meetings by using these consent agendas as you're describing. And they were always things about like team member reports, director reports, those type of things, and very helpful tool.
Thank you. All right, so the next couple I think are sort of maybe obvious, but the next one is really to ground the meeting in the mission, right? It's so easy to get disconnected, but consider starting off with a mission moment. It could be sharing by a board member, could be sharing by your CEO. The next is to focus on important issues, making sure that you're staying at the governance level. Consider flipping items, right? So those items that might require strategic conversation, put those at the top and put some of the routine business at the end. Stephen, any tips that you have on either of those items?
No, I think those are really solid. I mean, the mission thing, it's funny, on our agenda, we actually have our mission typed at the top, and that was sort of in preparation for our on-site visits. We wanted to make sure that if any board member was pulled aside in question, they knew even the basics of the mission. So just little things like that you can do to help instill confidence in the board. And then, yeah, I mean, you mentioned it, just staying at the governance level. The board should be looking through the lens of the bylaws. When you start to stray from that as a board, you start getting into some day-to-day things that we really shouldn't be involved in. So I love this point.
Terrific. The next tip is to limit verbal reports of materials in the packet. And I see that actually Julie has already added to a comment to chat saying that it was a difficult transition because the board was used to hearing executive staff verbally present all the reports, but now they have a section for a spotlight presentation, which rotates across services and departments, which is working well. Absolutely. I think, Julie, that is great. It's also great to hear, that there were some bumps, right? Like, let's be honest, anytime you're going to change a practice, it can be bumpy, but really being thoughtful about what also requires a verbal report out. And that also goes for committees, right, Stephen? I mean, you don't need to be reiterating everything that's in a committee report at your board meetings.
Very true.
All right, and our last two tips are making sure that there's a healthy board culture. We'll talk more about board culture in just a moment and social fabric. What we really mean there is that you're giving your board members time to get to know one another. There's data that shows that if you can build trust among your members, that they will be more comfortable and effective in governance. And then ensuring that there is time for board education. We know that this is a tall order, especially because you meet monthly. Board education does not have to fall in every meeting, but thinking with your board chair, what are those big issues that are on the horizon? And then a couple of meetings in advance, really building up, maybe instilling a video or something to help them learn so that they're prepared a couple of meetings down the road. Stephen, anything final to share on board meetings? I think I saw some questions come through in the chat I want to get to, but anything final to share there?
Yeah, the last thing you mentioned there about ensuring time for board education, I implore everybody to make that a monthly thing. There's such an advantageous opportunity there for CEOs to even get out in front of an issue that you think is coming in a month or two, get that sort of early exposure to the concept. We do it all the time, and it's been helpful for us. So as much as you can, I would encourage it.
Great. And I'm going to take one question now and keep one question for a moment later. So somebody was asking for clarification, Stephen, about whether the committee work plan, whether you see that as the chair's job, or if each committee chair should work on their own work plan that then cascades up. How has it worked for you?
Yeah, for us, it was the latter. So what we did is we started off and sort of challenged every committee chair to work within their committee, work with their C-suite and directors and chiefs, whoever was assigned to their committee, to define the scope of work, to figure out what is it that our purpose is within relation to the bigger and broader picture. So that took some time, and it took several months for those plans to sort of synthesize. Eventually, they all end up on a spreadsheet, and they're all broken down by date. And they could be things about when such and such policy needs to be reviewed and approved. It could be such things as, when to start thinking about nominating the next person for a specific position. It could be any of those things. And as you're sort of going through it, the best thing to do is just take notes, and you'll sort of figure out which things sort of come up. And for us, a lot of it there's a rhythm to it. And so we know a certain time of the year things will come up. And so for us, Emily, it was definitely the latter. It was the chair of that committee taking the lead to develop the work plan. And in all those instances, I was involved as chair of the whole board, encouraging, sort of guiding. And then of course, the end goal with all that is to now have a roll up for the executive committee So at any point, I can pull that up with our CEO, and I can tell you from our perspective, my perspective with our CEO, it's helped our relationship a ton, because now our CEO knows exactly what the board is going to be looking for. It allows him to plan ahead. It allows him to get out in front of issues often and prepare, or get other team members that he can delegate to get things ready for upcoming board meetings. So I think it's really, it was an investment. It was a huge project. But in the end, our CEO, it allows a lot more preparation, less stress going into these meetings month in and month out.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Stephen, sounds like such an effective way to be navigating the complexity.
Yeah.
I also wanted to just acknowledge we've had more robust exchange in chat. Lori shared their policy around the consent agenda must go out at least 7 days before the meeting, and board members, of course, can pull something if they think it merits discussion. But Lori, it's great to see that you have that carved out. Julia shared that they carve out 30 minutes to do board learning each month, and it's linked to their strategic priorities. It's a way to learn and make sure that the board's up to date on key issues, which is terrific. And then we had a question about what are the key areas to cover in board meeting minutes. And I think that could probably be a training in and of itself, but I'll just say from a high level perspective, going to make sure that there is adequate documentation of the meeting. Anything that's requiring board approval or discussion, you want to make sure that that's captured, especially items that are required by certain funders, especially including HRSA, not just HRSA, and making sure that you're capturing key themes of strategic issues that your board is discussing. And we can definitely pull out some citations in our governance guide for health center boards, which has a more robust listing. Stephen, anything to add before we move forward?
No, just real quickly, you nailed it. And the only thing I would add is if you're looking for a better experience, so your on-site visits, your minutes are everything. So take the extra time to communicate with whomever your scribe or your secretary, whoever's going to be doing that, and really highlight the specific areas. Because I can tell you in our experience, I've been through, I think, 3 or 4 of these now. The minutes really proved to be the thing that really highlighted the kind of quality and good discussion that we're having, and avoiding any sort of perceptions of rubber stamp activities, if you will. Yeah,
great tip. All right, let's go to our next slide. We want to cover next, which is defining and instilling a healthy board culture. So, ideally, this is actually a board-led activity, but in partnership with you as CEOs. So again, it sort of rests on the foundation about being clear about roles and responsibilities, but it also is a way for a board to really intentionally define, document, and hold themselves accountable for how they work together. So some ways that boards do this: they establish a code of conduct or a board culture statement. They go through the process of defining it together and actually update it every couple of years to make sure that it accurately reflects how the board wants to operate as a team. Others make sure that they spend time to explicitly establish norms around conflict resolution. So I'm thinking about the conflict of interest scenario that sort of arose with the disruptive board member that we talked about earlier, Stephen, and certainly sort of having a really intentional board culture agreements can help with this. And I'm going to take us to our next slide just for a second, just because I wanted to offer up some examples of how this might look. So these are just 2 samples, but Stephen, what has worked well for your board in terms of just really being explicit about how you want to operate as a team?
So this culture opportunity really surrounds around the chair. And I took this as an opportunity to really work with everybody on an individual basis. And so one of the things that I can share with you that's been successful for me personally is having conversations with my CEO, defining sort of what are some issues that have occurred or whatever's happening, and then sort of addressing it with that particular board member on a one-off. And then the other thing is, if it's sort of a situation where you're trying to create a culture of engagement, which is what we really want, I'll also have reached out to individual board members by phone or go meet for coffee or lunch or whatever, and really get that chance to constructively encourage them to be more involved, to get more involved, to speak up more. And so really, I sort of take this as an opportunity of, it's a reflection of your chair. And in this case, if you have a chair that maybe isn't as involved or super busy or not really supportive, this can be a big challenge. And we can certainly talk more about that at some point. But I would say, Emily, getting the chance to do this on a one-to-one basis and speak to each board member by taking the time to do that as board chair, it helped me to create this culture and really highlight a lot of these items that you've listed here.
Thanks for sharing that, Stephen. All right, let's go to our next slide, which is sort of our last pillar around effective governance, and that is advocating for board development. And there are many ways, even though this is a board-led activity, that a CEO can participate. So the first sort of good practice that we lift up is encouraging diversity, equity, and inclusion on the board and in recruitment. There's many ways a board can do this. Ideally, your board is approaching recruitment as an ongoing activity and not just episodic when you need a member, that your board is being really strategic about what do we need both now and in the future, perhaps using committees to help get folks interested in board service and sort of understanding more about the board role. And certainly, you know, while this activity should not be CEO led, ideally you're developing a partnership where your board comes to you for input on board candidates and or committee candidates. Stephen, what's worked well in terms of the relationship with the CEO related to this?
Yeah, you're right. We want feedback. And so we do bring information to our CEO looking for insights on certain things that maybe we have a blind spot for. But at the end of the day, you know, this one of the things that we were talking about in terms of making sure the board reflects the community we serve. And so it's using the data from our needs assessment, other sources to make sure that as we're recruiting, we're being very mindful that we have voices in the boardroom that match the patients that we serve.
Absolutely. A couple of other just quick tips, because I'm mindful of time, are ensuring a robust new board member orientation. So you know, sometimes we're very cognizant that this might fall upon you as the CEO and or members of your team. I think we're seeing a number of boards saying, we're going to lead this. We're going to lead our new board member orientation. I will point to a few tools that we have to help in just a few minutes, but this is really the best way to make sure that your new board members are set up for success and can come in day one really contributing. We've already talked a little bit about board self-assessments. We did have a question actually I meant to raise in the chat earlier, Stephen, which is just around how boards should think about assessing their own performance. And certainly I do recommend that a board engage in routine self-assessment so that it can carve a path for setting its own goals in areas that it may want to improve, and also to help it sort of chart a course for continuous learning. But any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's critical. We do this annually. We started where it was sort of a document with sort of spreadsheet with check boxes, agree, disagree, strongly, that whole thing. It was pretty tough to get through that. We've now sort of come up with the times, even though we still call them board packets, we use a survey now that is really, really helpful. I think it's through a Survey Monkey, we developed it, and it sort of encompasses all the elements of self-assessment in terms of how committee meetings are run, board meetings, is there enough education, length of the meetings, information we want to see, other feedback. And that information is then filtered over to the executive team. We review it, and then it ends up going to our committee, which does a lot of our board development tasks, which is our governance and administration oversight committee. It goes there, and then that sort of creates the groundwork for upcoming and future board education topics based off of the feedback that we receive on self-assessments.
Absolutely. And then the last bullet here, and then there's quite a few questions I want to get to in chat, is to not forget to focus on board succession planning. And so this is actually a couple of components, right? It's thinking about who overall on your board has a term that's coming to an end and or may not wish to serve another term, and thinking about what does the board need. And ideally that work is led actively by a governance or nominating committee, but it's also thinking about your officer succession, your committee chair succession, and getting that next cohort of leaders really ready to step into those types of leadership roles. Stephen, how have you, I know you've had a thoughtful approach to this at both the committee and the officer level, if you don't mind sharing.
Yep, it also included a review and change to our bylaws, Emily. We had a situation at our board where the way that the terms were structured and staggered, we would always hit sort of a wall where we were at this risk of losing a lot of really great people. And so we changed a lot of that at the bylaw level, where you know you work hard to sort of build up this team and roster of strong board members, and there was a certain point where it's like they were going to sort of just term out. So there were some changes there where we didn't want to lose their voice. We did put some limits around how long you can occupy a certain office, to keep sort of fresh blood running through all the time. And then from a committee level, yes, it's always constantly thinking about what and whom would be the best change here. And it's something that, hearkening back to the work plan, this is something that's listed on 2 different locations on our work plan about identifying future people, future board members that can be both within the executive committee, but also take over committee chair roles. And so there's so many moving parts, with our CEOs out on the line. The more that you can sort of organize this with your team, it's going to make your life a lot easier, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going back up in the chat. We did have a question earlier about exactly this. How do folks sort of plan for chair and vice chair succession? I think one thing that we've seen boards do very successfully is when it gets to that point where the chair has about a year left, really thinking about who's that chair-elect going to be, who can then shadow your chair. They might come to your meetings, so you actually might be meeting with your chair and your chair-elect as a way to transition the relationship. The second part of that question was, do you keep the same officers and executive committee members indefinitely? I would recommend not, as a point of practice, really making sure that you are having time for fresh leadership, but to Stephen's point, also not making it, necessarily every year so that it's a constant change, but really making sure that you're creating space for new voices. So the other thing to be intentional about with your board is making sure that you're really being intentional about how to make sure that it's not a particular type of board member, right? So that you're really taking an inclusive approach to this, making sure that your patient board members, your community-based board members, like everybody is being treated equally in your officer and leadership succession plans. Okay, a couple of quick questions about recruitment. We've got one about, is it appropriate for me as CEO to recruit board members? I think somebody provided a great answer, which is that you can, as a CEO, reach out to potential board members to let them know that applications or opportunities are open for applications, but that process is ultimately managed through a board committee, of course, hopefully with CEO input. So a CEO should not be going out and inviting people to join the board. That really is the board's work. And Stephen, we also had one question about how have you preserved board culture now that meetings are on Zoom? So I know, perhaps folks here are still meeting by Zoom. Some of you might be having your board meetings in a hybrid setting. Some of you might be back to distanced in person. I think sort of now we're in a little bit of a different place, but wherever you are, I think it is figuring out how to build in time, right? So whether you carve out that 15-minute opening, or maybe you invite everybody to join for a virtual dinner before to have those informal conversations. Stephen, what worked well for your board?
Yeah, we did several of those things, but I would say really it was some of the work we did behind the scenes within the executive committee where we were reaching out to individual board members, because the thing that was lost, maybe not lost, but just needed to be highlighted more, was that our board members were also experiencing this pandemic with their families and their businesses and their jobs. And to keep sort of that sense of culture that we strive so hard to build, by talking with them individually one-on-one and expressing our sympathies and our sincere interest in what was happening, how they were being affected, it sort of recharges them to when they came to the committee meetings, board meetings, they weren't feeling like they were bringing all of their situation. They actually came ready, prepared, knew the material, ready to serve, ready to be a part. And so it was a lot of work behind the scenes where we were reaching out to people individually and figuring out ways we could get together and have, like you said, virtual coffees, virtual cocktails, in terms of like happy hours. So yeah, you name it, anything we could do to try to express and really showcase our concern for each board member individually. And that then in turn short to more caring and more thoughtful board meetings.
Yeah, I really thank you for that example, Stephen, because we ask a lot of our board member volunteers. It's not an easy task. People do it because they're really passionate, but remembering that the human side of governance is really, really essential. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, let's go to our next couple of slides. I know we're getting close to time. We just do have a couple more reflection questions you can think about. What good governance practices does your board have in place? What could they benefit from adopting, and how might I raise that with the board or relevant committees? And then we will continue to go forward. The last thing that we want to do is really make sure that you're aware that NAC has over 50 free tools and resources, including many in Spanish, to support health center boards. This is really just an overview slide. If you use the QR code in the bottom, it'll take you to one of our websites where you can find more information. I am just going to give you just a quick brief tour. We'll go to the next slide. Something that we have to really help with your board member orientation are foundational resources to help board members understand their role. The item actually on the very bottom is we have a board member orientation PowerPoint template and facilitator guide. It's available in English and Spanish, and it can be customized by your health center for your own board's orientation. So hopefully that will be helpful, especially if you're revamping or updating. Two other things I wanted to make you aware of: the governance guide for health center boards is also available in English and Spanish. That has 11 focus areas and 20 customizable tools. So somebody asked earlier in the chat about a sample board assessment, and you can definitely find a sample board assessment in the appendix of the governance guide for health center boards. We also have a short video that I referenced earlier about health center board roles that could be a helpful tool to incorporate into your board member orientation. All right, next slide. We also want to make you aware that some of the first feedback that I heard when I stepped into my role at NAC from board members is, please stop doing hour-long webinars. We really want short, digestible modules and tools that we can use in our board meetings. And so we have a 5-part series in English and Spanish to provide an overview of the board's role with financial oversight. It goes through how to read various financial statements. Everything that I'm talking about is actually linked in this slide deck. And so Cindy is sharing in chat that that was added to the calendar, and they'll also be in NaudlePod. We'll go to the next slide. We also have a series of videos about the board's role, what you need to know, what they need to know about needs assessment and strategic planning, as well as diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice and governance, and really how boards are thinking about combating racism. So those might be helpful conversation starters. All right, almost through. Next slide. We also did a robust series on COVID response. We have a series of articles that can help your board. I know we're sort of coming to a different point in the public health emergency, but a lot of this is still relevant, thinking about how quality oversight has changed in recent times. We have a primer on telehealth, especially to help new board members sort of think about that. Stephen and I did a short article on tips for board chairs. We also have a specific resource about recruiting and retaining board members during this time. And then for those of you that are considering hybrid board meetings, there's also a newer article on that. Okay, I think we've got 2 or 3 more. CEO succession planning and transition. We have 2 toolkits. One has sample succession plans and policies. The other is not ones your board will need right now, but in the event they ever have a future CEO transition, might be helpful to them. And then pertinent to our conversation earlier about conflicts of interest, we do have a short overview around conflicts of interest. We have a short overview of CEO compensation, and one of our newer resources addresses the board role in corporate consolidation. So if you're considering merger or asset acquisition, that's one for you. All right, next slide. Okay, other training and technical assistance needs or ideas, please reach out to me. I know I've actually heard from some of you, and we have products in the pipeline that we are actively working on. I also saw a request around other languages. I would say if there are specific language needs, I would love to hear that from you. And that's the end of our formal presentation. I think we're just in time to get our mentor reaction, and then we'll have time for more questions in just a few minutes.
Thanks, Emily and Stephen. Exciting engagement in the chat, a lot of great comments and questions aligning with your presentation. I want to give Craig Glover a chance to react and respond to what he heard and thoughts related to his role as a CEO. And while we're listening to Craig, if you have questions that you want to start populating the chat with for Emily and Stephen, you can go ahead and do that. And we can also have you raise hands and come off mute and have a conversation after Craig's comments. So I'll turn it over to Craig.
Thank you, Cindy. First, I want to say thanks to Emily and Stephen for a very comprehensive overview. Every time I see information on board governance, I always end up with a whole page full of notes of different things that I've learned. So one, they did an excellent job. So I'll just add a couple things, more so highlighting a few key things that sort of pop to mind for me and my role as CEO. The first one is make sure that you set boundaries. So they spent some time talking about the role of the CEO versus the role of the board. And I've heard from some of my colleagues inside the community health center movement and other people I know that work for nonprofit boards. I've even seen it as a member of some nonprofit boards that it's not uncommon for the board to start to skew the lines and get into management. So you want to make sure that there are boundaries, and you want to make sure that you have a relationship with your board that you're comfortable enough to say, hey, that's not really your job. In a previous health center that I worked for, it was time for us to hire a new chief medical officer, and our board vice chair was adamant that they had to be involved in the selection. And I kept saying, but that's not your role. That's not governance. That's management. That's my role. So, again, make sure you have that and that you understand your role compared to what the board's role is. Stephen said something that I really like, that as I was sort of processing it, I realized I kind of take this approach. So Stephen mentioned that, one, you want to make sure you have open dialogue with your board, but he said lead with the worst. So start with the worst and make sure that they understand, what's really going on. It's not our job to sugarcoat what's happening. We need to be upfront and direct. And I always lead from and look at my role with the board from the standpoint of, I need you to hear something negative that may be going on in the organization from me and not hear it from the street. The last thing you want as a CEO is for one of your board members to call you up and say, hey, I was in the grocery store and Mrs. Thompson said this was happening. And that's been going on in the organization for some time, and you haven't told them that. So, make sure you have that open dialogue with them. Another thing, the shared commitment between the CEO and the board chair, make sure you have a good relationship, that you understand how they want you to communicate with them. Some board chairs want you to pick up the phone and call them. Other board chairs want you to email them. There are lots of different ways. And as we talked a little bit about board member and board officer succession planning, make sure when you get a new chair, you don't just assume that they are going to respond the same way the previous one does. So, as those leadership roles change, make sure you're making the adjustments so you're building that trust and dialogue with them. And then last sort of highlight is make sure that you're staying at the governance level. This sort of goes a little bit back to the first one about setting boundaries. And I'll tell you a very quick story. I know we're running a little short on time. In my first health center that I worked at in St. Louis, and I was in the C-suite, my peers would often complain about the CEO and say, well, he's a micromanager, he's a micromanager. And I kept saying, I don't get that feel from him. Where are you all getting this from? And then what I started to realize is that my peers would go to the CEO and, like, for example, if they were hiring someone, they would go in with 3 resumes and say, can you help me pick a person? Well, then he'd help them pick someone because they asked a question. Then they walk on and they say, well, he's a micromanager, he hires my people. Well, I never did that. He wanted to see the people. I would go in with, hey, here's my person that I want. Say yes or no to this person. If you say no, I'll walk out of the room, bring you back a different person to look at. But I never really asked for him to make those kind of suggestions. So I use that as an example to say, if you want the board to stay at the governance level, then you need to present them information that's at the governance level. If you start getting into the operational part with them, then they're going to start to assume that maybe that's part of their role, or that's what their role needs to be for you. And then all of a sudden you're somewhere, complaining about, well, my board's too far into the operation. So stay at the governance level with them. The last thing I'll wrap up with is, Emily and Stephen showed us in the last few slides there's lots and lots of great tools out there from NAC. I even saw a couple things that I guess are relatively new that I didn't realize were available that I'll have to go back and look at. So as you're trying to navigate the governance lens in your health center, be sure to reach out, be sure to utilize those tools. And, thanks, Emily, for providing your contact information so that people can reach out to you. So again, I appreciate the great session that you provided for us.
Craig, thanks for your insight and kind of summarizing and wrapping up. I saw some nodding heads from both Stephen and Emily as you commented on some of the highlights that you recognized. Emily, there are a couple of questions in the chat, and then if folks have questions and want to come off mute, just raise your hand and we can entertain those in the last few minutes that we have together.
I saw that, and I actually wonder, Craig, if you'll stay on to help us answer this first question, because I think you probably have a perspective. To what degree do you tell the board about people issues with staff, including firings, et cetera? How have you handled that?
Sure, thanks, Emily. So a couple of things. So one, if there is a termination at the executive level, the CFO, CMO, whatever, I will usually tell the board about that upcoming transaction before it happens. So, and again, I want to sort of stress that I'm telling them I'm not asking for permission, because again, I don't want them to hear about it in the grocery store that, oh, the CMO is no longer with us. As it relates to the other staff, below the C-suite, I generally don't share that information with them unless I feel like there may be some issue that may come to their attention. So, for example, if you had to do a termination that you think the person may want to file an EEOC complaint, or if it had to do with sexual harassment or something like that, then I will mention that. Luckily, I haven't had to do that very often, and even then, it's more of, hey, I want to let you know about a situation. We terminated a person. I don't even get into names, but it's more so we had this issue that came up. This is how we dealt with it. And it's kind of more FY if someone brings it to your attention.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Craig. Stephen, anything you want to add from the board lens?
No, I think that's such great work, Craig. It's exactly what I would say as well. If it's C-suite, executive, that level, just sort of giving a heads up what's going on. And then anything that would result in legal or financial impact, the potential of any negative legal or financial impact, like you mentioned, maybe a down the line employee, if you will, going to take some kind of litigation or something. Just giving a heads up, exactly as you announced it, not specific name, job title, location. Just this is generally what's going on. Lead with worse.
There you go.
This is Lori. I wanted to share something real quick. We had a provider that we hired once that went through, the formal processing for credentialing, et cetera, with the board. This provider did not tell us that they were being investigated, which of course is by our contract, that's terms for firing that provider. But we did have to go back. I mean, it wasn't something that happened obviously with us, because they had been only working for us a few months and had just started seeing patients before, we found out about it through the board. And so as soon as we did, we went back and told the board, this had nothing to do with us, and the, provider wasn't truthful and didn't go into any, further, information, because quite frankly, if they wanted to know, they can go online and look themselves. But we weren't going to bear the burden of going into those details, since it had nothing to do with us. So just FYI, when it comes to credentialing and privileging, sometimes that might be treated a little bit differently, since that's a board required responsibility.
Thank you for sharing that, Lori. Stephen, one other question that came up in the chat was, what alerts can we establish, when board members are stepping into management and management stepping into board? And I think the short answer is sometimes it'll just be really obvious if your board starts trying to ask about, to Craig's point, hiring decisions that are really granular, or wanting to look really, really, deep into data that's not in their purview. And I would say a couple of things to consider are setting those ground rules around how you're going to handle it when that happens, right? Is it going to be the board chair who's going to sort of step in, or is every board member going to be empowered to sort of call the question? Stephen, any thoughts on that particular issue?
I think you highlighted it perfectly. I just think always referring back to the bylaws. It's sort of the one thing where everybody can come at sort of a common agreement that this is our realm as board members. And if we deviate, then we have a common agreement that we'll come back and to reset, which may be needed at some point, that our reset point, our common ground, our mutual place of agreement is always the bylaws. And once we go there and you sort of see what is and isn't covered, then the answers will be really straightforward.
And then we do have a question. I thought credentialing and privileging isn't a requirement for the board anymore. Did I read the section wrong? You did not read the section wrong. HRSA no longer requires the board to approve credentialing and privileging. Other accrediting bodies might. So I'm less familiar with other accrediting bodies. And the other thing is thinking strategically about whether it just is advantageous to continue to involve your board from a strategic perspective. So, but thanks for that clarifying question, Rhonda. Any other questions, or anybody that would like to come off mute to share either a question or frankly something that's working really well, or a challenge even that you might want to dig into with our remaining time left with your peers?
Emily, if I could mention something, I know we briefly touched a little bit on board minutes. And one of the things, and I'll share it, a copy of ours. But one of the things that I found over the years is if you can structure your minutes in a way that it makes it easy to find things that are required by the board when you're going through an OSV. So, so for example, your board has to approve the annual budget, or the board has to approve the SAC. If you can structure your minutes that make it very easy to find that. I mean, what we do on ours is kind of, there's the topic on one side and then the discussion. And we actually went through an OSV in December, and our governance reviewer was, he was very excited about our minutes. He said, because it made it very easy for him. He was able to just kind of flip through and see, annual budget, they approved it on this day, and do that. So just kind of a tip. And again, I'll put a sample in Noodlepod. If people want to see how we're doing our minutes, that you may find it to be helpful.
Nice.
That's terrific.
Emily, we've got a kudos for you in the chat for board member boot camp and recommendation to have staff attend boot camp to learn more about the board. And I'll ask Olivia if you could pull up our last slide as we close. Again, if you have something you'd like to throw out to Emily and Stephen in the last minutes, please go ahead and raise your hand to do so. I'm just going to go over some closing information for you. The evaluation link was put in the chat for you. It would be great for you to provide Stephen and Emily some feedback on today's session. Here are some upcoming dates for you as well. Our next session, Tuesday, March 22nd. Gerard also sent an email out today regarding the in-person wrap-up session with key links for registration and hotel information. So check your email for that. And you should have upcoming mentor group meetings to participate in as well. The recordings from today, both this session and the revenue cycle session, will be uploaded into Noodlepod within a week or so. So you'll have access to those, and your pre-work for the upcoming module on strategic use of data is due in the community on March 15th. With that, I'd like to say thank you to Emily and Stephen for sharing their expertise and their time with us today. And I've got like a minute and a half left if anybody has like one last itching thing they need to ask. Otherwise, I wish you a great afternoon, and we'll see you in our next session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.